It's the most humbling thing I've ever seen. They have far superior in-vehicle technology. Huawei and Xiaomi are in every car.
That clip you just saw is from the CEO of Ford Motor Company, Ford, and he is talking about the importance of the US being competitive with China and specifically with Chinese EVs, which are coming out now, basically being pushed out to the world, and they're pretty impressive. And this is exactly what he's saying. He's saying that the United States, and specifically companies like Ford, are many years behind Chinese EVs. And this is an American CEO who says that he goes to China 6-7 times a year, and he takes his entire leadership team to China to buy the new models of cars that have come out in order to see what the competition, is doing. And it's a very interesting interview. It came out a while back, and there have been some clips of it popping up, specifically this clip right here.
How many trips to China have you made in the past year?
I would say 6 to 7.
6 to 7?
Yes.
And what are you seeing there that we should learn from?
It's the most humbling thing I've ever seen. 70% of all EVs in the world, electric vehicles, are made in China. They have far superior in-vehicle technology. Huawei and Xiaomi are in every car. They have facial
Meaning
recognition.
cell phone technology.
Yes. Yes.
Connected to their cell phones.
Yes, you get in, you don't have to pair your phone. Automatically, your whole digital life is mirrored in the car. You have an AI companion that you can talk to, ChatGPT equivalent in China, to all the automatic payment is already there. You can buy movie tickets. It has facial recognition, so it knows who's in which seat and which media you like.
And as we can see with this clip, he's talking again about the Chinese EVs are pretty far ahead in terms of what the US is putting out, and specifically what Ford is putting out. And basically, he's talking about how China has invested a lot of money into the EVs. I've talked about this previously in some of my videos where I talk about EVs and how Chinese cars and Chinese manufacturing is way ahead in terms of the United States, or even Japan or other countries now that were pretty big in automobile manufacturing at one point. But now China has the largest market for cars and vehicles, and it has the largest EV market in the world. And so they are, of course, focused on Europe and other parts where they can export their cars to, but because their market is so big in China, they have been able to develop so rapidly. In the last 20 years, he even mentions this in the video. He's saying that China's been doing this for the last 20 years.
And back to China, people don't realize that China has IP that America needs. It has battery
Could we just
processing.
steal it the way they do to us? No, I'm sorry.
I think we just need to be more humble as a country, that they do things really well that we need to learn. They have been investing in electric cars for 20 years. BYD has not been doing this for 5 years. They've been doing it for 20 years.
So they have experience and expertise that American companies do not have, because at best, they've been doing it for a decade or so. Maybe if you look at Tesla, a little bit longer, but they don't have the same manufacturing and infrastructure involved in putting so much resources into EVs. I went to BYD's headquarters back in 2021, I think. I think it was 21, maybe 22. But back then, I went to their headquarters down in Shenzhen, and I even did a video about it. And they were already far ahead in terms of manufacturing, whether it's the batteries or just the luxury and the quality of the cars compared to Tesla at the time. And it's one of these things that have flown under the radar because most people in the United States have never seen a Chinese EV. They've never even seen a Chinese car because the United States is protecting their domestic market. They don't let Chinese cars in, and the few that may make it in tend to be under a different brand, or somehow it's a joint venture type thing that it's not really a Chinese car, or people don't see it as a Chinese car. He even talks about this in the interview, talking about how important, I guess this is the next point. So the first point is he was saying China is way ahead in terms of EV production and what they're producing from the technology standpoint, from the luxury, just everything, the price point, everything. They're far ahead in terms of what they're producing compared to the United States. And he's basically saying if Ford doesn't catch up, and if Ford isn't able to compete with China, then Ford as a company will fail.
And even beyond that, their cost, their quality of their vehicles is far superior to what I see in the West. I mean, we are in a global competition with China, and it's not just EVs. And if we lose this, we do not have a future Ford.
So he's saying this company will fail if we cannot compete with China, and at the current, situation, the current market, they aren't competing with China. So he's saying this is why I take my leadership team to China every year, and we look at what they're doing, because we need to improve our own cars, otherwise we will not be able to compete. And it's really interesting because this is the next point that he said. He says when they go to China and they buy 100 or so models that have come out, whether it's BYD or now the Xiaomi car that's coming out, or any of the other brands, because there's lots of manufacturers in China. Maybe you haven't heard of them because you aren't living in China, but there's lots of different brands that are producing EVs. And so he was saying that they go and they buy, 100 vehicles, and then and this is where it's interesting, because China gets accused of this all the time, and they're demonized for this. But as soon as an American CEO says they're doing this, it just, nobody even bats an eye. But what he says is after they've driven those 100 vehicles, and I'll play the clip, but after they drive those 100 vehicles, they narrow it down to maybe the 5 to 10 vehicles that they all love. Then what he says, and this is where, China's been bashed for so many years, what he says is they ship those 5 to 10 cars back to their factories, to their headquarters in Detroit, and then they drive those cars and they test those cars, they take them apart and they rebuild them. Which is very interesting because that sounds like reverse engineering, and that sounds a little bit like stealing your competition's technology. And this is something that China has been bashed forever, that they steal and reverse engineer technology. So let's actually listen to what he says.
I go for a couple reasons. I bring my whole leadership team. We don't leave anyone behind. And the first thing we do is we get the last 100 cars that launch there, and we drive as many as we can. And then we pick the 4 or 5 that we love, and then we put them on a plane and fly them to Detroit.
Wow.
And then we drive the crap out of them, and we take them apart and we put them back together.
And you can see the moderator doesn't gasp, and you can see that the audience doesn't say, whoa, this is wrong, right? Which, if a Chinese company came out and said, hey, we've been importing Ford cars for the last, 50 years, and we've been reverse engineering them, you would have every mainstream media in the world saying, look, China admits to reverse engineering Ford technology. Other way around, nobody cares. So that's really interesting, because I think that's an important point, because he's admitting, one, that Chinese cars are better. He's also admitting that they are reverse engineering those cars to try to improve their own technology, right? He's flat out admitting it. And that is really wild when you think about it. So that's a point that I think is really interesting, because if you've been following the China space at all, they talk a lot about transferring technology through joint ventures. And this is also really interesting because later in the interview, he says that's exactly what Ford needs to do. They need to create joint ventures with Chinese companies and transfer the technology from China back to the home company. That's literally what he says, is we need to transfer their technology back to the United States, to the home company. He even said country, but corrected himself and said company.
And how we learn is through joint ventures and cooperations and partnerships, but we can't be so obsessed with China's enemy that we aren't humble enough to set up those business structures and then have people in those companies, in those JVs, that transfer the knowledge and the know-how back to the home company, Ford. Without this kind of mechanism, these kind of partnerships, and by the way, they need us. We have distribution systems. We have intimacy with our customers that they don't know. They don't know how to make quality in a lot of countries. We do after 120 years.
So basically he's saying we need to create joint ventures with the intention of stealing Chinese technology, and nobody batted an eye at all. But China's been doing this for the last, 30, 40, 50 years, where if any company came to China said, no problem, you're allowed to come here, but it's a joint venture. And the Chinese company owns 51%. Therefore, they're the majority, stakeholder in that company, in that joint venture. And then technology needs to be transferred to China. And all these car companies in the 80s and 90s and even into the 2000s had no problem with it at first. They all signed those joint ventures and they all transferred the technology to China and Chinese companies. And then when China started to improve on that technology and surpass the United States because they took the time to improve, that's when they all started calling foul and saying, oh, China is forcing us to transfer our technology to their companies. China is forcing us. And China, in its defense, says, we never forced you to start a joint venture in our country. You signed the documents. You agreed to the agreement, right? You agreed to the contract. That was on you. You could have said no, but we said these are the requirements in order to enter our market, in order to work in our country, and in order to do the business that you want to do in China. These are the rules, and you agreed to it. Now you're calling foul and saying that China has stolen all this technology and transferred all this technology, but in reality, you made the agreement. And now, when you're on the other foot, where your technology is not as good as China's, you're literally trying to implement that same strategy, saying we need to go to China, create joint ventures, and force them to transfer technology back to the United States. As if that's not the very thing you demonized for the last, 50 years. So it's a very interesting interview because on the one hand, he understands what's going on. But on the other hand, he doesn't realize that exactly what he's attempting to do is what China did in order to improve their country, in order to create the industries that they have today, and in order to lead the world in so many industries. They had a playbook that was super effective, and now they're number one in so many industries because of this. Now the American CEO is basically saying we need to do exactly what China did in order to retake the top spot in many of these industries, specifically cars, without any irony to the fact that they've been demonizing China for doing this for years and years and years. He also made one more point. He made a lot of points, but I'm specifically talking about the points related to China. He also made one more point that I found really interesting. Again, talking about how data is transferred, talking about who has the rights and ownership of things. And he was saying that Chinese cars are very technologically advanced, and they have self-driving capabilities, and they can store a lot of data like most modern cars. Now, there's a lot of computers in modern cars, from your GPS to your self-driving capabilities to just all the electronics in a car, including cameras and things like this. And he was basically saying that if we let Chinese cars into the United States, then it must be very clear how the data is handled, and that the data needs to stay on servers in North America or in the United States specifically is what he's trying to say. And it's really funny because when China put laws into place saying that Google, Facebook, all these other companies, news sites and things need to store Chinese data in mainland China because we don't trust the American government with that data or American companies with that data. There was this outpouring of, oh, I can't believe it. China's this totalitarian state that is forcing American companies to give their government, give the data to the government, and blah, 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 blah. It's this whole outcry and this outpouring of, this is unbelievable. China's this oppressive government that's trying to take all of America's data that they've collected in China and keep it in China. And this is why many companies now are unable to operate in China. Now, it's not a ban because they say if you follow the rules that China has put in place, then you can operate. Facebook, Google, all these companies could operate in China if they were willing to follow the Chinese rules, but they aren't, and so therefore they can't be accessed in China, and it's considered a ban. Basically, he is saying that the Chinese companies would have to store their data in the United States for security reasons.
The second thing is people need to understand a car is not a 1980s car. It has cameras, it has microphones inside of it, it can be autonomously driven, and therefore it's extremely, if you're apprehensive about a balloon, you should be very apprehensive about a modern automobile. So we need to have guardrails about how the data gets moved. It has to stay in a cloud in North America. It can't be used against us. We need to understand these cars are incredibly powerful technology. The average Ford has $3,000 or $4,000 of silicon in it now. So we need to have policies in our government for national defense and privacy to protect our citizens. And that is required.
That's literally what China said. That's what China said, is that the American companies would have to store their data in China for security reasons because we don't want all that data ending up in the United States or to the United States government, especially when it comes to mapping, driving on the roads. The car is going to map everything. That's a lot of data that it's taking in from the cameras and the LiDAR and everything else. That data could be used for military purposes because you would know where every street is, everything, every stoplight, every local shop. You have mapped out all of the cities in China, in the countryside. So if you were planning any kind of military action, you know exactly where everything is. That's kind of the security aspect of it. And so that's why China said you have to store that data in our country so that we can control it and know where it's going. Now the United States is saying exactly the same thing. Well, not the United States, but this individual who is, the CEO of Ford is saying the exact same argument. So it's really funny that he has basically said every argument that China has put forth for why they're doing what they're doing, the United States should do. They should transfer technology. That's what China's done. Now the U.S. is saying, and this individual is saying the U.S. needs to do that. They need to store their data in the U.S. when China said they needed to store it in China. It's a really interesting argument because there's no irony in it, and there's no awareness that everything that he's proposing is literally what made China strong. And now he wants to do that in the United States. He was even talking about China has subsidized a lot of these manufacturing and EVs and battery production and EV production, that they've subsidized it, giving them tax incentives to produce EVs, giving them free land, helping them with developing the technology and developing the manufacturing capability. And he's basically saying, I don't have that in the United States. So if we want to compete with China, then the United States government needs to give me subsidies. They need to give me land. They need to give me tax breaks. They need to do the things that China's doing in order to prop up this industry until it's strong enough to kind of stand on its own. So it's a really interesting, interview. If you have time to watch all of it, I'll link it down below. Because it's an American CEO who's gone to China many times in his life, fully understands what's happening in China, and says, let's implement those strategies in the United States, without the irony of realizing what he's saying, but then kind of he is aware of what he's saying. It's just it's this weird twisted logic, because if you blame your enemy for doing it, blame your competitor for doing it and saying it's wrong, but then trying to implement it yourself, somehow it's okay for you to do it, but it's not okay for them to do it, especially if it gives them a competitive advantage. It's kind of this, mental gymnastics that what's good for me is good for me, but what's good for you is, and bad for me is bad for you. Or, it's kind of this weird way of jumping around. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, because I feel like we're going to see more and more of maybe business leaders coming out and saying what the politicians can't, or what they're afraid to say, because business is business and money is money. And business leaders are required to understand the global landscape, right? You can't be a multinational company and have a CEO who's only focused on one market or doesn't understand what's going on around the world. And so I think the next few years, maybe 5, 10, 15 years, we're going to start seeing the business community completely deviate from maybe the politics. Maybe not a complete deviation, but enough of a deviation where you'll start to see fractures in truth coming out from the business community, where they're saying, look, we can't compete with China unless some things really change. Even in this interview, he was talking about, well, we can't look at China as an enemy, because if we look at China as an enemy, that can lead down kind of a bad path. We can look at them more as competitors, or we can look at them as somebody we can cooperate with in order to transfer technology back to the United States. But we can't and shouldn't look at them as the enemy, because that doesn't actually create any benefits for the United States. So I think business leaders will be forced, just because of the realities on the ground, to acknowledge what China's done and start to somewhat deviate from what the U.S. politics and kind of the mainstream media has been saying, because at the end of the day, China is defeating the United States in many industries. And you can try to pad the numbers any way you want, but China is absolutely dominating the U.S. right now. And in not all industries, obviously, not everything, but in many industries, they're leaps and bounds ahead at this point. And that is only going to keep growing. And then at some point, the business communities will have to acknowledge that if things continue, the United States won't be competitive. Like right now, it's not super competitive, but if things continue, it's only going to get worse, which means you can't kind of hide it behind padding the numbers or pretending like China's just some part of the equation when it is the equation. So yeah, let me know what you think. Do you think that the business community will stay in line with the politics and we're just headed down this road, and where it ends up, it's hard to predict, but it looks bad? Or do you think that there might be a split, because money always talks, and maybe the money starts to go in a different direction, forcing the politics to come more in line with the reality of what's going on in the world, which is China's winning. Yeah, so what do you think? Leave a comment below, and let me read your opinions on specifically this interview, but also just in general. Is China winning? Is it going to need a big shift in, the mentality of the Western world, so to say? Or is it just going to keep going and there's going to be no correction, and that could lead to who knows what? I mean, we know what, but who knows what? Leave a comment, and I'll see you in the next video.